So a lot of people have asked me if my second birth was easier. And the simple answer is no. But there are a lot of reasons why. And that's what this video is going to be today. Hello, my name is Frankie. Welcome to my channel. And today's video, we are going to be covering whether I think the second birth was easier than my first. So if you haven't already seen them, I have done a birth vlog and a birth story for both of my births. So if you have seen that, you will know that both of my births have been very speedy, and my second daughter was quicker than my first. Now, a lot of people think of quick births as the ideal. And whilst I would much prefer a 4 or 5 hour labour over a 24 or 25 hour labour, there are definitely some cons to having a fast birth. And I think the biggest one is that sometimes, and definitely with my second, more so than with my first. So my first labour with Juno was about 6 hours. My second labour with Rhea was almost 4. Just under, I think. So 4 hours from start to finish. That's like no pre-labour, nothing. I literally went into labour and 4 hours later she was born. And like I was saying, there are loads of pros and cons to quick labours and deliveries, and it is all well and good at being speedy, but that has such a huge impact on your body and so intense. My waters broke, and within minutes I was having regular contractions. Obviously my uterus had to sort of dilate from 0 to 10 centimeters in 4 hours. A lot of women that takes days. And my body just kind of seems to do it really quickly, which I think is a good thing. But also in terms of actually giving birth, it's definitely more intense when it's sort of that fast. So I found that aspect of my second labour harder. With my first, although it was still really crazily fast, 6 hours for a first labour is not very common. So although it was really intense, I didn't, until she was sort of moments before Juno was born, I felt quite in control. And with Rhea's birth, whilst I didn't feel out of control, my body, I feel like I wasn't in control of my body, and my body was just doing it, and I just had control's not the right word. I felt as if, with a little bit more time, maybe I could have just kind of kept everything a little bit more under control. Having said that, I don't know. I've never had a really long labour, so I don't really have anything to compare it against. But I do know that my second child's birth was harder than my first. I think another thing that made it harder for me is that everyone says it's going to be easier. So you have this kind of preconception that like, oh, well, I've done it before, I can do it again, which is 100% the truth, and you definitely can. And I did do it. Everyone said, your body's done it before, you've stretched before, you've birthed before, you've pushed before. All of those things will kind of come more naturally and be easier. The word easier was used quite a lot. And I think when that word is used a lot, it's kind of put in your head and you start to believe it. And whilst I'm all for manifesting and everything like that, I did believe that it was going to be easier. And when it wasn't, I think, that made it feel harder. Slightly naive of me, maybe. But I did think it was going to be easier, and therefore it was harder. So I think one thing that was actually quite different about my births, which made Rhea's birth harder, is that with Juno's birth, she kind of descended on her own, and then I only really had to push for probably about 30 minutes. Whereas with Rhea, I had the urge to push from about an hour and a half before she was born, and she kind of needed all of that pushing, which is surprising because she was actually smaller, like a whole pound and a bit smaller than my first baby. But I felt as though my body had to really work hard, and I was exhausted. I was pushing kind of every 2 minutes for an hour and a half. And compared to Juno, where I just had to push for kind of 30 minutes and then she just came out, it was, yeah, quite different actually. It's just mad how that's possible. Like smaller baby, second baby, quicker labour, but it took longer to push her out and it felt so much more exhausting. And I was exhausted afterwards, like way more exhausted than I was in my first. So yeah, I don't think that second labour was easier, unfortunately. I'm so sorry if you're watching this and this is you're due to have your second baby. By no means take my experience and think it's going to happen to you, because a lot of people say that their second labour was easier. And that's why people ask the question, was it easier? But unfortunately, in my case, I don't think it was. As well as the labour being harder with my second, I would say the recovery was slightly harder as well. In different ways, actually, now I'm thinking of that. In some ways it was better and in some ways it was harder. So I hemorrhaged after my second labour. I lost quite a lot of blood. I had to have a few procedures done in theatre, and the recovery from that was harder on me physically, mentally, everything. I was on lots of antibiotics, so I didn't feel great from those. I was injecting myself with like blood thinners and stuff to reduce clotting. So that aspect of my second labour was harder. That aspect of my second recovery was harder. But with Juno, I think I felt a lot more physically exhausted in my like body. I can remember like not wanting to kind of move, couldn't really like sit down for a few days without it hurting, which is obviously really normal. I healed a lot. It took a lot longer for my body to heal. And you know, I had stitches and it took longer for that to heal, and breastfeeding was harder to establish. So there's loads of pros with your second, because, you know, bleeding stopped quicker. I healed better in general. Breastfeeding was easier. Breastfeeding is easier. So yeah, there is obviously a beautiful baby that is completely worth it. And I would do it again and again and again and again and again forever if I had to, just to have her in my arms. So totally worth it. Doesn't mean that it wasn't a hard experience, and doesn't mean that I can't think it was a hard experience and I can't say to people it was hard, because it was really hard. And my first labour was hard as well, but just not as hard as my second. I would say, like, physically, it's the most, I mean, any mother will probably say that physically it's the most sort of challenging thing you'll ever do. But I would say that Rhea's was physically more challenging than Juno's. And that's fine. I've got two beautiful baby girls. They are completely different, and their births were completely different, and their pregnancies were quite different as well. And yeah, it just proves really that no one is the same. So just that little video from me today, guys, chatting about whether I think my first labour was harder or my second. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week for my weekly upload. Lots of love. Bye.